For more insight on what the worsening spat indicates for the war in Ukraine and shifting geopolitics in Europe, let's speak now with Dr. Malcolm Davis. He's senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Davis. Firstly, I want to get your reaction to Mr. Trump calling Zelenskyy a dictator and blaming Ukraine for the war. Is this an attempt to court Russian favor or part of a broader strategy?
Look, I think Trump is basically capitulating to Putin at every opportunity. And I think that the statements coming out of the Trump administration are nothing more than Trump bending the knee to Moscow. And I think what you're seeing here is Trump trying to create a narrative that justifies him walking away not only from Ukraine, but also from Europe as well, and basically abandoning Europe and Ukraine to the mercy of the Russians. So I think, when you see what's happening here, and people make the comparison with 1938 Munich and Peace Now Time, this is worse than that. This is an utter abandonment of key allies at the greatest hour of need, and essentially dramatically raising the prospect of a Russian attack against Europe itself.
Wow. And also, Mr. Zelenskyy responding by describing Trump as being in a disinformation space created by Moscow. I mean, given the heightened tensions and stakes at this moment, do you think it was wise for the Ukrainian leader to challenge Trump publicly, regardless of his frustration?
Absolutely, it was, because what Trump is doing is throwing Ukraine to the wolves. Zelenskyy has every right to challenge Trump on this, because what's going to happen is that any peace deal that the US and Russia agree to at Ukraine's expense, excluding Europe from the table, will see the Russians make all sorts of demands in terms of additional territory that they want to control, keeping Ukraine out of NATO or the EU, no NATO or EU peacekeepers on the ground. So basically, Ukraine ends up at the mercy of the Russians. The Russians can use peace in our time as an opportunity to rebuild and regroup and then launch the war again to take further territory. I think Zelenskyy is correct to challenge Trump's outrageous statements.
Dr. Davis, the United States is the single most important donor to Ukraine. What does the future look like for Ukraine now in terms of military and humanitarian aid, given this tension between the two leaders?
Look, I think, let's be realistic. There's going to be no more US military assistance going to Ukraine, no more financial assistance going to Ukraine. Ukraine now has to turn to Europe. And I think that Europe, in its own interests, has to stand up and stand on its own 2 feet and recognize that in a crisis, it may not be able to count on the United States as well. Article 5 of the NATO Charter says an attack on one is an attack on all. I now no longer believe that the US will honor its obligations under Article 5 of the NATO Charter if Russia does attack Europe's eastern frontier. And from Ukraine's perspective, I think they need to start thinking about alternative supply of military assistance and economic assistance. They can't count on the Americans any longer.
Well, then how do you think this widening rift between Trump and Zelenskyy potentially impacting peace talks? I mean, do you think Ukraine is going to get a fair deal in the end?
Absolutely not. I think that what Trump and Putin are about is effectively imposing a peace that benefits Putin in every respect. We've gone into this situation before negotiations have even started, with Trump giving major concessions to Putin. And I think that, once those negotiations really get underway, Putin will make all sorts of demands, not only in terms of Ukraine, but also in terms of NATO as well. And Trump will give in to every single one. So there's no way that Ukraine is going to get a fair and just peace out of this current process. And I think Ukraine does need to actually now work with Europe, including potentially, as Macron and Keir Starmer has suggested, some sort of European force on the ground in Ukraine to try and strengthen its hand, because the alternative is that Russia will, as I said, take what it wants in any peace negotiation, use a ceasefire to rebuild and regroup its military forces, and then in a year's time launch the war again to take more territory of Ukraine. Let's be clear, Putin wants to destroy Ukraine as a functioning state. He wants no Ukrainian government. He wants to occupy most of Ukraine, and then he wants NATO to withdraw from Eastern and Central Europe. So this is not just about Ukraine. This is about Putin's determination to end NATO and force NATO's capitulation. And Trump, unfortunately, seems to be assisting Putin in that process.
Dr. Davis, you wrote 2 days ago, you think the U.S. president, his administration are capitulating, yielding to Putin. You mentioned this off the top of our conversation as well. My question is why? What is Mr. Trump's end game in all of this?
Look, that's really hard to ascertain. I mean, I think the generous view was that the US is really concerned about China and recognizes that it needs to focus on the Indo-Pacific to deter China. So effectively, it's walking away from its commitments to Europe, including Ukraine, in order to focus on China. But now I'm not so sure. The fact that Trump has gone so far, so quickly to deliver what Putin wants suggests there's something more here than just simply a realignment of forces from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. So I do think that we are in a very uncertain situation. We're uncharted territory at this point. It's evolving on a day-by-day basis. We simply don't know where this is heading. There's already discussions about the US withdrawing forces from the Baltic states and cutting the US defense budget by 8% every 5 years. That's going to essentially really undermine the US ability to deal with China. So I really don't know where the Trump administration intends to take this. I suspect what it is that Trump has this mindset that if he has the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Pacific Ocean on the other, he has some sort of defensive shield against attack from missile systems. He talks about an Iron Dome, and he does deals with dictators like Putin and Xi over potentially Taiwan. Then a Fortress America situation can emerge, and that would then align with his intention to try and claim Greenland and the Panama Canal and try and force Canada to become the 51st state of the US. So he has a Fortress America mentality that somehow, if he sits there in the US, ignores the world as everything goes horribly wrong, the US will be fine. Unfortunately, that's not the way the world works, and I think he's in for a rude awakening.
Always appreciate your time on the program. Thank you so much. Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute.